Welcome to Futuro McAllen Breakfast Series. We are very pleased to have you here. I would have started just a little bit sooner, but Olmo Maldonado, our genius over here, had to hook me up with a microphone first, and that took a little while. So we are very pleased this morning to present what we think is very important to all of us here in the Valley, and that's a legislative preview. With the election, obviously, that's going to be very important to all of us, and there's a lot of things coming up. I hope that isn't me. I thought I turned it off. Olmo, you didn't turn off my phone. Even the best of geeks, and Olmo lets me call him a geek, even though my son tells me I'm insulting him, but Olmo lets me do it. Even the best of them forget to turn your cell phones off sometimes. So if you haven't turned your cell phone off, please do it now. Don't be like me. We are very much interested in pursuing some of the issues that affect us, and one of the things that we are working on, and Davis is going to remind you at the end of the session, we are making some decisions with the Futuro McAllen Board on our spring programs, one of which will be a city candidate forum early in March. We are also considering some other things, and Davis will bring you up to speed on that, but we would like for you to be thinking and give us some feedback at the end of this session on whether you prefer morning breakfast such as this, or whether you prefer evening meetings. And this will be an issue that the board will be discussing. So would you please be thinking of that? And with that, I will turn you over to Davis Rankin, our moderator.
I turned on the Texas Tribune this morning and found out there's a fight for the speakership. A guy named Scott Turner of Frisco, who's 42 years old, and a black man wants to defeat Joe Strauss of San Antonio. Now, I wouldn't have known that. Apologies to the monitor guy sitting back there. I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't gone to the Texas Tribune. Ross Ramsey is one of the co-founders of the Texas Tribune. I'll let him tell you all about where that comes from if he chooses to, and why there is a need for what amounts to a statewide newspaper, but it's an invaluable way to keep abreast of what's going on in the state of Texas. I will let you read this. I promise not to go into this, but I think our speaker brings a great combination of journalism worked in government, worked in newspapers, worked in radio, got out of that business, and has been doing this in Austin and had a newsletter, Texas Weekly, for a long, long time. So he brings a lot of experience. He has a good memory still, and will let us know what's going on and who's going to hit Bob in this next coming session. So would you please welcome Ross Ramsey to Texas.
This is the tape we hear later on YouTube, right? So I thought the easiest way to do this would be to peek in the rearview mirror at last week and see what we got out of the election, and then sort of take that forward and look out the windshield and see what's ahead of us. I think if you ask the people who were elected last Tuesday at the statewide level, in 10 years, what happened in 2014, none of them are going to talk about their general election. They're going to talk about their primaries. The Republicans who won, all won handily, as you know. The fights that they had to win their seats were mostly back in their primaries. Dan Patrick had to get past 3 statewide elected officials to get the nomination for lieutenant governor. And after that, although she's a very good, capable politician, Letitia Van de Putte was easy. He beat the sitting lieutenant governor, he beat the land commissioner, he beat an agriculture commissioner, all on their way up, all well funded. They talked about his mental health. They did all kinds of things to him. I think he's going to remember that race for a long, long time. And 10 years from now, if you ask him how he got to be lieutenant governor, he said, I had to beat these 3 guys. Oh yeah, and then there was another race. I think there are a lot of races like that, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that Texas has become, in some ways, what it used to be. It's a 2-party state, but both parties are Republicans. It used to be a 2-party state with both parties were Democrats. And at the moment in Texas, it's these 2 factions in the Republican Party that sort of animate our politics and tell us, kind of give us a better idea what's going on. We saw it in the Republican primaries. I think we're going to see it going forward into the session. But just a couple of notes about the election itself. All of the statewides, executive and judicial and federal, are now Republicans. That extends an unbroken winning streak for Republicans that began in 1996. This is no longer an anomaly. It hadn't been an anomaly for a long time. The one Democrat on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals was, he was elected as a Republican. He changed parties so he could run for the Texas Supreme Court. He got beat. So we're back to all Republican judges too. The only swing district in the Texas congressional delegation, there's 36 districts. The only swing district is the one Pete Gallego had that goes from San Antonio on one end all the way to my hometown of El Paso on the other. It's one of the biggest districts. It may be the biggest district in America. And it's one of the true swing districts. It has, in the last elections, gone Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. And it depends on whether the top of the ticket is a governor's race or a presidential race. Pete went into this knowing that it was going to be a very, very tough race. He lost in large measure, not completely, but in large measure because my hometown doesn't turn out. El Paso County is about the same size, give or take, as Collin County, which is one of the really important Republican counties in statewide elections. El Paso County turned out 50 or 55,000 people last week. Collin County turned out 178,000. So the turnout problems in some of these counties, describe the results in some of the races. Likewise, the only swing district in the Texas Senate is a district in southern Tarrant County that used to be held by Wendy Davis. There was some question before she ran for governor, before she decided to run, whether she would be able to win that district. She won it twice with Obama on the top of the ticket in presidential election years. And again, it's one of these districts that you can win it if there's a big turnout. If there's a smaller gubernatorial year turnout, it's very tough for a Democrat to win. And in fact, the Republicans won that. Republicans picked up 3 seats in the Texas House. That increased their numbers to 98. This happened before in 2011, after the 2010 elections. And the first thing that happens after an election like that is everybody picks up their Facebooks. And these are the old kinds of Facebooks that are on paper with pictures of faces. And they have them for the House and the Senate. They pick them up and they start going through, the Republicans start going through to see which Democrats might switch parties and give them a supermajority. If you have 98 people, you're too short. The Democrats do the same things to see which 2 or 3 Democrats they have to call and make sure that they stay planted. But I would expect sometime between now and the end of the year to see some efforts. We might not even see them, but to see some efforts to flip a couple of the Democrats so that the Republicans can get a supermajority. The Republicans broke through in Dallas County, and this is kind of interesting. There are a few counties in the state that have already flipped from red to blue. Dallas County is an interesting one. When I was a baby reporter, I worked there, and it was flipping from blue to red. And becoming what had been a solid yellow dog Democratic county was flipping over to the Republicans. And you could tell when all the judges, regardless of what their names were, flipped over. Just one year they were all Democrats, the next year they were all Republicans. They've held this county, the Democrats have held the county now for 10 years, but they had a DA who really screwed up. His latest big screw up, Craig Watkins is his name, his latest really big screw up was he got in a car wreck and used asset forfeiture funds of his office to pay his way out of the car wreck, and it became public and everybody was talking about it. But Dallas County is one of the few counties where straight ticket voting, one of the few former Republican counties where straight ticket voting is really determinative. About 68% of the people who vote in Dallas County vote a straight ticket. About 55% of those vote for the Democrats. So the Democrats have this built-in wall, and most of them survived this election, even though Republicans had a pretty good year. The one who didn't was Craig Watkins. So the Republicans are crowing about that. The Democrats are crowing about it a little bit too. This is one of the areas that Battleground Texas had targeted. And they got sideways, as these things will go, with the Dallas County Democratic Party, and they kind of agreed to disagree. You go your way, I'll go my way. Battleground lost all of its races in Dallas County, and the Dallas County Democratic Party won all of its races except for this DA. So I think that party will flip back to blue in future elections if they have better DA candidates. I think they learned a little something. The voter turnout fell in spite of the state's growth after the last 4 years. There's more people in Texas than there were in 2010. There are about 700,000 more registered voters in Texas than there were then, and voting was down about 271,000 people. We were 51st in the country. The way you get there is you count DC. We were 51st in voter turnout then, and we fell. So we've fallen from 37% turnout in 2010 to 33% turnout this year, and we're still 51st. A lot of people on both sides of the aisle are trying to figure out why that is and what that means, but as it stands, Texas is sort of the hallmark of lousy voter turnout. Wendy Davis did not do as well as Bill White. One of the things that the Democrats were looking for this year was, well, if we lose, you know, they kind of expected to lose. Texas is a Republican state. It's a Republican year. The subject on the table was Obama, which is not, you know, in the 6th year of any presidency, it's really hard to be in the president's party. That was a bad year for George Bush. That was, actually, Bill Clinton got away with it. It was a bad year for Ronald Reagan. It's typical that your second midterm is pretty bad. So the Democrats knew they were in a tough environment, and they were trying to build to get back to at least competitive. And so some of them were looking at, they weren't talking really loudly about this, but they were looking at things that they could do short of victory that would be wins. So if we don't get 50%, if we don't win a governor's seat, we don't win a Senate seat, whatever it is, what is it that we can look at that's an advance? One of the numbers they had in mind was 42.3%. That's the vote that Bill White got in 2010. Bill White was the highest performing Democratic gubernatorial candidate since Ann Richards. Tony Sanchez got 39.9, he got 42.3, and one of the things that the Democrats were hoping for this year was that they would at least outperform Bill White. Wendy Davis didn't outperform Tony Sanchez. And in fact, those 271,000 votes that disappeared from 2010 to 2014, if she'd had all of those votes, she still wouldn't have beat Bill White. On the other end of the scale, Greg Abbott outperformed Rick Perry. So the gap got wider, not just because she didn't perform well, but because he performed better. And that's how we got a race that's how we got this string of statewide races that were 16, 18, 20 points, 16, 18, 20-point victories. One of the interesting things about this election was that at the top of the ticket was that a lot of it was about biography and not about issues. You know, sometimes you'll see a race that they're fighting about whatever they're fighting about. You know, George Bush, when he ran against Ann Richards, said, I'm going to run on 4 things. Do you remember this? And he pounded them so hard that I can still remember them 20 years later. Juvenile justice reform, tort reform, education reform, welfare reform. So when you win an election and you do that, and you say that over and over and over and over and over, when you go into Austin in January and get sworn in, you can go to the legislature and say, you heard them. They said they wanted these 4 things. And that legislature responded very quickly. You see this in elections all over the place. I ran for city council because I wanted that low water crossing, or I did, you know, whatever it is. They're coming out of this election with kind of fuzzy mandates. If you got 60% against your opponent, the voters emphatically endorsed you. But what did they endorse? Did they just like Greg Abbott's style? Did they like that he fought his way back from a terrible accident that put him in a wheelchair? Or was there something specific that they were talking about? And I think it's probably more the former than the latter. So one of the things that I think you'll see as you go toward the legislative session that begins in January is Abbott, Patrick, and Strauss, Joe Strauss, the House Speaker, trying to describe the mandate and the wish list that they're going to pursue as they go forward and try to translate those 60% votes that they got into something that they can take to the legislature and say, the voters are behind me and I want to do these things. Abbott started that by a couple of things. He said in his first meeting with the press, this is, you know, when he was announcing his transition team, he came out and said, I want to keep creating jobs in Texas. I want to elevate education. I'm not sure exactly what he meant by that, but that's the phrase he used. He said he wants to keep the budget balanced and that he wants to do something about the immigration problem. Now, the Republicans this time talked about immigration a little bit differently than they have in some past elections. Not all of them did, and not all of them did it the same way in the general election as they did in the primaries. But instead of talking about a sort of a xenophobic, these people are coming over the border, although there was a fair share of that, they talked about law and order. And it turned out that one of the things that resonated with voters along the border was that they were not talking so much about immigration as they were talking about crime. And it's a little bit different frame and a little bit different coding when you're talking like that. And it's one of the reasons that Abbott performed really well with Latino voters. So these are crosstabs from the governor's race. Just to give you an idea, if you're completely overgeneralizing and you're talking before a race, you would say Democrats typically do better with younger people, Republicans typically do better with older people. Democrats typically do better with women, Republicans typically do better with men. Republicans with Anglos, Democrats with minorities. And Abbott blew up some of those numbers. 18 to 29-year-olds, they were virtually tied. 30 to 44-year-olds, they were only 3 points apart. Those ought to be Democratic votes in a normal year. 45 to 64-year-olds, 66% Abbott, 33% Davis. 65-year-olds, 71-29. By gender, men were 66 to 33 for Abbott, women were 54 to 45 for Abbott. So he won among women by about 10 points. By race, Anglos, 73-26 Abbott. African Americans, 7 to 92 Davis. That's a normal number. And Latinos were 44% for Abbott, 55% for Davis. A normal number there would be 35 or 40 for the Republican. So he performed better there. One last number here that I'll tell you that breaks it down by gender and race. Among Latino men, Greg Abbott actually won by 1 point, 50 to 49%. Among Latino women, 39 to 61%. So I think some of the ways that they addressed some of these issues, some of the ways that they talked, they actually came down and talked to the voters in typically Democratic areas, and they changed some of the numbers. So Bill White won in 28 counties out of the state's 254 counties. Obama won in 24 counties. Davis won 19. So they went a little bit backwards on that. There were a couple of counties. Bexar County is one, where Leticia Vanderpute is from, where Davis lost and Vanderpute won. So the voters came back on some of those. As we go into the legislative session, we have a House that changed about 24 seats, which is a normal turnover. There's 150 people in the House. They turned over a couple of dozen seats. They didn't change the partisan makeup by a lot. Like I said, the Republicans picked up 3 seats. So I think, at least in terms of the political environment inside the House, we're going to get the same mix, more or less, back that we had last time. Some of the lieutenants to the Speaker left, so he has this two-sided, it's kind of a double-edged sword. When your top people leave, your top people leave. So you lose some of your lieutenants, and you don't want to do that. But you have these seats to pass out, these chairmanships to pass out to people who've kind of been waiting in the wings, and you don't get a built-up level of frustration from people who aren't participating in leadership. So Joe Strauss will be having some new leaders in there, but the mix of the House will be about the same as it was. In the Senate, we elected 6 new senators 2 years ago, which is a really large number for the Senate. And this year, it looks like we're going to elect 8 and maybe 9. Leticia Vanderpute is talking about running for mayor of San Antonio. If she does that and leaves, it's 9. If she doesn't, it's 8. So 14 of the senators, maybe 15 of the senators, there are 31 total, will be new. And in almost every case, even among some of the Democrats, the people who came in new are a notch or 2 or 3 more conservative than the people that they're replacing. So we have a very conservative leader in Dan Patrick of the state Senate, and he's leading a very conservative body. So go back to what I said at the very beginning about the 2 parties in the Republican Party. You have a very conservative activist wing. Some people call it the Tea Party. That's not exactly right. Some of them are movement conservatives, some of them are social conservatives, but they're very conservative, and they want to see some things done. And Dan Patrick embodies that part of the party. He's a pretty good representative of that's what they're like. Joe Strauss over here is sort of the establishment party, and this is the Republicans that you grew up with, the ones that you're more familiar with, the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, the Episcopalians, those kinds of Republicans over here, and he embodies that part of the party. And that is really kind of where the fight is. So let's talk about this speaker's race for a minute that Davis referred to. Scott Turner is a former NFL player. He played sort of a journeyman. His last team was the San Diego Chargers, a defensive back. When you walk up to him and shake hands with him, he's just one of those, you just forget what professional athletes are like. You walk up and shake hands with him and you go, he's denser and better put together than the rest of us. It's sort of surprising. He's a really nice guy. He's very inexperienced. He ran for Congress in California. When he got out of the Chargers, in fact, LaDainian Tomlinson endorsed his congressional campaign. Do you remember Duke Cunningham? It's one of the guys who went down on one of those congressional scandals. He was being paid by defense contractors to buy really, really expensive toilets for submarines, I think, or something like that. He lost his seat. That opened up a special election. 1 billion people ran, and one of them was named Scott Turner. And he finished back in the pack, but he got a taste of it and wanted to participate in politics. He was raised in Richardson, Texas, up by Dallas. He moved home, or close to home. He lives in Frisco now and ran for the Texas House a few years ago. He was part of the wave in 2010. And now he wants to run for Speaker. And he's the candidate for this wing of the party, for the conservatives, the Tea Party. He actually is a Tea Party guy. And their first vote and their symbolic vote of the session is, if you are with us, you are against Joe Strauss. And so their first vote when they get to Austin is going to be, you have to vote with us on this so we'll know where everybody is. I don't think that they think that they're going to win. I don't think that they can win with Scott Turner. He's a very nice guy, but I don't think he's the candidate who can win the speakership. But what they want is a show of hands, because if everybody walks in and they're either a Democrat or a Republican, they're already labeled. If everybody walks in and they're a Republican and there's two factions and you're trying to figure out who's who, you want the gangs to mark themselves. And so the way you mark the gangs is you call a vote on the speaker, you get a public vote. That one votes for Turner, that one votes for Strauss. Okay, now I know where everybody is. So I think that's how that session is going to open. And then we're going to see a set of issues come forward that will largely be determined by Greg Abbott. And we're back to fuzzy land here a little bit. I'm not sure exactly what his list will be, but during the first 60 days of a legislative session, they're not allowed to consider legislation on the floor unless the governor has declared it an emergency. And what constitutes as an emergency is exactly this. The governor says so. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be in peril. Pauline doesn't have to be tied to the tracks. We've had emergency issues on brucellosis. We've had, I think we had sanctuary cities one year. I think we had HPV vaccines. It's whatever a governor says it is. So one of the first marks of Greg Abbott when he does his State of the State speech somewhere in late January, early February is going to be whether and what he lists as emergency issues. And that'll describe his idea of the agenda at the beginning of the legislature. We'll do the normal things. We'll do, the only bill that they have to pass, this is an old line, the only bill they have to pass is the budget. And they have a peculiar problem with the budget this year. They have more money than they're willing to spend. They had, a couple of years ago, they had not enough money. And so they felt like they had to cut education. It turned out that they didn't have to, but at the time they honestly thought they had to cut education. So they cut that by $5.4 million. They put some of that money back. This time they're coming in, the idea was when they came in 2011, they didn't have enough money. This time they're coming in and they have more money than they can spend without getting a majority of those conservative Republicans to vote and say, I think the state budget should grow faster than growth in population and inflation, right? They'll come in next week or this month anyway and set a number and say, here's the growth number. The Legislative Budget Board will set this. And the growth number will be, we take last year's budget, next year's budget can't grow any more than this amount unless 2/3 of the legislature says so. It's a very conservative legislature and it's very unlikely. But it puts them in a weird situation because people come to them, conservatives and liberals alike, and say, I like what you've done with holding the line on taxes and all of this, but we really need a road over here, and we really would like to have clean water when we turn the tap, and water at all when we turn the tap. And they're starting to turn to some of those expensive infrastructure issues. So they're trying to dance between the things that people want and the price of the things that people want. And they're coming in and they've got all of this money mostly from this boom in oil and gas in Texas. We have 3 of the largest gas plays in American history going in Texas. I think 2 of those gas plays are in the top 10 of all time. And money is flowing into the state coffers. The rainy day fund, which used to be, it's overflow money from oil and gas. And they used to use it to balance the budget. And it used to be a remarkable thing when that was $1 billion. It's going to be about $9 billion, and it's on its way to $13 billion. So they have plenty of money. A state district judge in Austin has declared the state school finance system unconstitutional. He basically said that the state set a standard, and they're not putting enough money into the schools to meet that standard. So he said, you know, you basically have a choice. You can lower your standard, which legislators are loath to do, or you can put more money into the system. That's being appealed to the Texas Supreme Court, and I don't think the legislature will get to it in this legislative session. But the reason I brought that up in that order is I think that the idea that they're waiting for a ruling on school finance and that might be expensive is going to be the excuse they use during the legislative session for not spending the pot of money that they have. We'd love to spend it. We'd love to help you. We know you want this or you want that or you want whatever. But because of this school finance ruling, we're going to hold the money back. That'll also probably delay calls for property tax reform. There's been a movement. You may have heard some of it down here. It kind of started in Houston this time. It's about whether the appraisals for commercial and industrial and residential property are done equally and are done fairly, and whether homeowners are getting a raw deal. In Houston, they think the homeowners are getting a raw deal. In some other areas, they think industrial taxpayers are getting a raw deal. There's a property tax fight ahead. I think that might be part of the battle over school finance when we finally get to the battle over school finance. School choice will be up this year. This conservative part of the Republican Party has been clamoring for years for vouchers or for the ability to move around. Texas already allows students in failing school districts. There's a particular term there, but it allows a student in a failing school or a failing school district to transfer within their district or to another district if there's room available. So there's a little bit of movement in the system that way. These guys want more. They want you to be able to move into a private school, maybe take your state money with you. I think we'll probably see a vote on that. There is a battle over higher ed. It is not over mascots. I personally think they should have gone with the chupacabras, but that's just me. El Paso, my hometown, got a baseball team after years of not having a baseball team. They got a baseball team, and there was a faction really rooting for the chupacabras, and we got the chihuahuas instead. So the name's still available. Anybody wants it? The fight in higher ed is largely within the University of Texas system right now, but you'll see it in other places, and you see it in other places around the country. It's not just in Texas. And it's this idea that education, it's a combination of things. Higher education has gotten too expensive. It's too disconnected from the job market. So you send a kid to the University of Texas, you pay a gazillion dollars, and she comes out with a liberal arts degree, and what are you going to do with that? And the schools ought to be, this line of thinking goes, the schools ought to be more tied to $1 in, $1 out, or $2 out, more of a management by objective sort of inputs, outputs idea, rather than a kind of a classical education idea. Is it supposed to be a really big trade school? Is it supposed to be a classical education? Is it supposed to be something in between? And there's a big tussle over this, and the conservatives would like to make this more accountable and would like to make it more a system where you send a kid to school, you get this output, you go forward. There's the people who defend the system want to keep it going like it's going. I think everybody agrees that tuition has gotten too high too fast, and they'd like to find a way to solve that. But in the legislature, the problem with solving that is that it costs money. So this has been going on for a while. I don't know if you followed this. There was a big fight over Bill Powers, the president of UT, between him and the regents. That was one manifestation of this. The University of Virginia had a fight just like this, and the regents who wanted a more input-output based system got a president of the university fired, and the clamor was so fast and so furious that they immediately rehired her. But there's battles like this going on all over the place. Texas A&M had a version of it a few years ago. Do you remember something called the red and black spreadsheets? This was, they were going to measure every professor by how many students went in, how the students did, how the professor was rated. It was all on these big red and black spreadsheets. And that idea died. But it's all of this sort of inputs, outputs kind of idea with education. And I think it's one of those fights that's going to ripple into the legislature. Immigration has become, for the legislature, sort of an interesting thing. The two big issues in this election were, are you with Obama or against him? So you saw the Greg Abbott ad where a vote for Wendy Davis is a vote for Governor Obama. That's what that's about. In our polling, if you ask people what they think of the job President Obama has done as president, in our last poll right before this election, 48% strongly disapproved of his work, and another 30% only somewhat disapproved of his work. They like him better than Congress, but not much. So Obama was one of the issues in the debate, in the larger debate. The other one was immigration, and less, as I say, xenophobia and more law and order, which has to do a lot with what the state can do, which is they don't enforce immigration laws, they don't do border patrol, they don't do all of that stuff, but they can send National Guard troops. So I think we'll see the legislature early on talking about, and this could be one of Abbott's emergency items, early on talking about keeping the National Guard in place, spending another $200 or $300 million on keeping them there, and increasing pressure, political pressure on the administration to do something about immigration. Medicaid expansion is back. This is like a magical Coke machine. One of the things that happened in the Affordable Care Act was that they said states ought to expand their Medicaid. We ought to expand our medical communities. In Texas, if you just do a quick back of the envelope thing, if a third of Texans are uninsured, and you suddenly said, let's insure those people, now there's a demand for medical services that wasn't there before. If we're going to insure them, they're going to go to doctors. It's like, you know that book, that kid's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? If we're going to insure them, they're going to use doctors and nurses and hospitals, and we don't have the capacity right now because we're built for 66% of the population. So if you flooded some money into this, then you could build out your medical infrastructure and you could build the system up. That's part of the idea behind Medicaid expansion. So the feds set up this thing where they said, if you will, here's my magic Coke machine. If you put a dime in this Coke machine, $1 comes out. So for Texas, it was about $11 billion in over 10 years and $100 billion back. And the state turned it down. We weren't the only state that turned it down, and we turned it down for specifically political reasons. It was, we're not going to invest in Obamacare by doing this. This is the management talking, Rick Perry and David Dewhurst largely, but some others too. We're not going to invest in Obamacare by doing this. We don't think the federal government has the money to do this, and we're not going to be involved in bleeding the federal government like this. We just don't want any part of it. Now, there was a group of lawmakers, including a fair number of Republicans, who were saying, you're nuts. This is great economic development. We need the medical infrastructure. We need the money. We should absolutely do this. And if the federal government has $100 billion laying on the table that says Texas on it, and Texas doesn't come claim it, they're going to send it elsewhere. It's not like they're not going to spend the money. So I expect this fight to come back a couple of ways. There will be sort of the regular push from the medical community. There's a lot of economic development money on the table. Let's go get it. And the federal government has started to make some noises. We had a story in the Tribune yesterday about, yesterday or the day before, on the federal government saying, beginning to hint that there's another $29 billion, I'm sorry, in Medicaid money already coming to Texas. Maybe if you don't do the expansion, we won't send you that. So now there's a gun to the head. So I expect this to be a big issue as we go into the session. It'll be wrapped up in the budget negotiations. It'll be wrapped up in the continuing, Texas versus the federal government. We don't like Washington thing. The other thing going on here in these early days is transition. It's been a long time since we changed horses. Perry is the longest serving governor in Texas history. Greg Abbott's the longest serving attorney general in Texas history. David Dewhurst is the second longest serving lieutenant governor. You get the idea. We haven't turned this over in a while. And we're going to see a bunch of new faces. We're already starting to see some of them. Judge Koskos is going to be the Secretary of State. Chip Roy, who was a Washington lawyer, do you remember when Rick Perry wrote this book, Fed Up? Sort of the middle finger to Washington, D.C. His ghostwriter was named Chip Roy. He's a lawyer from Washington who has worked for John Cornyn, for Rick Perry, and for Ted Cruz. He's going to be the first Assistant Attorney General to Ken Paxton. We're waiting to see who the new controller names as the new deputy and as the new revenue estimator, who will be the people who say, here's how much money the state has to spend going forward. All of these people in government, this is going to ripple through for a while. Greg Abbott starts a new round of appointees. It takes a governor 6 years to go all the way through the appointment cycles. There's staggered terms. But this is going to be the first, we're in the third generation of Rick Perry appointees in all of our boards and commissions. And so we see some fresh faces there. So one of the big stories out of Austin is going to be who are these people and what are they doing? How are we going forward? Really quick one, and then I'll pop this open for questions. There's always a sort of a game between the top three officials during a legislative session. I have a younger brother and a younger sister, and it was always 2 to 1, but it was never the same two, right? It's always sort of like that. And that's how it is a little bit with the governor and the lieutenant governor and the Speaker of the House. And so, this will all go wrong 15 minutes after I say it, but our starting positions are, Joe Straus's agenda has been about infrastructure for a long time. He was the guy largely behind the water legislation that you voted on last November, behind the transportation amendment that was on the ballot this time. He's kind of taken the viewpoint, look, we're having all of our political fights and that's fine, but let's get some things done. Let's show some wins for the Republicans. He's been big on property tax reform and is big on ethics and dark money reform. Dark money is basically when you can set up an organization that takes part in politics without revealing who its donors are. That's the fastest way to talk, and they call it dark money. So I'm a rich guy, I throw a bunch of money into this group on the condition or the understanding that my name's never going to be in this, and Texans for really great stuff goes forward and does whatever I want them to do. The state's trying to regulate some of that. The groups that are in line to be regulated are fighting back. I think that's one of the battles that we'll have in the legislative session. And the dark money has tended to be with the very conservative Republicans and against the establishment Republicans. So this is another one of those issues where those two sides line up a little bit. Dan Patrick's agenda has been fairly straightforward. And interestingly, Patrick ran to the right, as we say, in the Republican primary. He campaigned as more conservative than David Dewhurst or Jerry Patterson or Todd Staples. And then often what you see in national politics is you'll see a Republican or a Democrat run to their most ardent partisans in their primary, and then in the general election come back to the middle to talk to the rest of us. In this election for lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick didn't come back to the middle. I moderated the one debate that they had between Patrick and Vandepute, and one of the things that really stood out in that debate was that Dan Patrick was talking about the same things with a lot of the same rhetoric that he had used in the Republican primary. He didn't move back to the middle. So the tone of this is going to be pretty full-throated, red meat conservatism. And the issues he's talking about are immigration, social conservative issues, private schools, this is the voucher issue again, and school choice. And he's also talking about property taxes. And Abbott, as I said, is talking about ethics, education, immigration, jobs. So that's sort of where we start the three, and we'll see how they fall and where they all land from there. Let's see if there's any sort of overarching things. One last thing I'll say, just it's a thing about the way the legislature works. These offices all have power curves. There's a moment when you're more powerful and a moment when you're less powerful. And during a legislative session, The first powerful person is the governor. That first 60 days that I was talking about, you set the agenda, you come out, you're the noisemaker. There's going to be a big inauguration for the first time since 2000. There's going to be a State of the State speech. There's going to be a lot of stuff about Greg Abbott and Cecilia Abbott and, all of that stuff. And he's going to set an agenda. And the governor's power will be sort of peaking while everybody else sort of lays back for a minute. And then the end of the 60 days, there's a moment, in every governor's existence when they bring a budget of their own to the legislature, and the legislature says, thanks, throws it over their shoulder, and goes on with their own work. Appreciate you stopping by. We'll see you in a few months. That's the moment when the governor's power starts to decline, and the speaker and the lieutenant governor really come into power. This is around the Ides of March. It's around the middle of March. And that continues until about the middle of May. During April, you'll see the budget being written. You'll see all of those roads crossing. In late April to early May, bills that have been in committee and sort of down at the grumble level start coming to the floor, and you start seeing the real debates on the floor. And mid-April to mid-May is when you see the House and the Senate really banging. And then at the end of the session, in the last 2 weeks of May, the governor's power starts to come back up. He starts to spike, and you're entering a period where the governor's vetoes become a clear and present danger, and the legislature's ability to override those vetoes begins to disappear. And when you get to the end of the session, Rick Perry did this pretty effectively. It made people really, really cranky for a while, but he came in early on and vetoed a record number of bills after his first legislative session. And it had two effects. The first effect was it vetoed a whole bunch of bills. It made, all of those authors crazy. A lot of them said they didn't see it coming. But it also gave Perry a reputation as that guy has a gun and he'll use it, right? And after you do that once, you don't have to use the gun as often. You just have to wave it around a little bit. So you get to the end of every legislative session, and everybody's kind of looking over their shoulder to see if the governor is okay with stuff. That's the governor's power coming back up. And then the day-to-day power in government, sort of over the 24-month period between every election, the day-to-day power in government is most powerful in the Attorney General and the Controller. They're involved in everything the government does. The Controller has all the money. The Attorney General has all the law. It involves them in everything. It involves them in every agency's business. And sort of their day-to-day power level doesn't peak like the governor's or go down like that. Doesn't do what the Speaker and Lieutenant Governor do. But day-to-day, those offices kind of a slow and steady pace. And they're also the places where the next governors and state senators or U.S. senators and those kinds of people come from. AG, there's a joke. This turns out to be national. I thought it was just Texas. AG stands for almost governor. And if you think about the last line of Texas attorneys general, if they didn't go to jail, they ran for governor. So that's kind of a layout. That's where we started last Tuesday, and how the elections look and what the session looks like from here. Almost everything I said will have some variation. We'll get into the session, and haywire things will happen. You'll be in there, and there's sort of like, if you're listening to the House, it's like listening to the teacher in a Peanuts cartoon. That wah, 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 wah. And after a while, you sort of get lulled, and you look down on the floor one day, and there's 21 television cameras. And you go, what is going on here? And it'll be something you didn't see coming. One year it was the cheerleader booty bill. You remember this? It was a bill to regulate sexy dancing by high school cheerleaders. It ate 3 days of the House's time. And what that means is if you're trying to get something done in the legislature, there's always things at the end. It's actually sort of almost part of the process. There are things that begin to eat bandwidth. There are other fights that are sort of, there are the fights that you hear about, and then the fights that occupy all of their time. And those aren't necessarily always the same fights. There's going to be a big fight this year over whether Walmart can sell booze. Texas has these really Byzantine alcohol laws that were written right after Prohibition. And it involves things like this guy has a distributorship that can sell to bars, but he can't sell to consumers. This one can sell to consumers, but not to bars. This one can't sell on Sunday. This one, it's this thick. It employs a bunch of lawyers. And Walmart wants to sell booze, so all of that's going to be in the air. They've hired 1 million lobbyists. There's a thing called the Texas Mutual Insurance Association, which was set up as a risk pool for workers' comp insurance. You can't get insurance anywhere else. You go to the risk pool. And it has become decreasingly controlled by the state. That was the idea. They set up this public-private thing. We'll give it full faith and credit for a minute, and then we'll wean ourselves. And we're now at the point where the Texas Mutual Insurance Association wants to be private, but they have $2 billion. And the legislature would like to grab some of that before they go. So they've all hired a bunch of lobbyists. So there'll be things like that that come up. There'll be things that we didn't talk about that dominate time, and everybody says, why didn't you talk about that? It's just because we didn't know. So thank you all.
I've got the microphone, and I will come to you to ask a question. But let me ask the first question. Where were you on the booty bill since you have a daughter?
Over on the side, gleefully writing.
All right, serious question. Carlos Cascos, what's your interpretation of that appointment? Does that mean he's going to run for state office?
You know, it might be. Abbott's running a play George W. Bush ran. This was Tony Garza last time, right? When we did this in 1994, Bush went to, and it's a signal to, it's a couple of things. It's a signal geographically. It's a signal that Hispanics are welcome in the Republican Party. That's the signal he's trying to send. Usually secretaries of state try to run for something. It's not always. Hope Andrade hasn't run for anything. I don't know what Nandita Berry's going to do. Tony Garza did run. Jack Raines ran for governor. Ron Kirk ran for U.S. Senate. It's a launch pad. It's a place to raise your visibility. But at this point, this is more about Abbott than it is about Cascos. And it's more about, where's Abbott going to go for his appointees, particularly the early, high-level, symbolic ones that everybody's looking at. Get the mic, hang on.
Boston Fire Marshal.
Say it again?
The fire marshal of Boston, right? Did they ever resolve the burning of the governor's mansion because of the fire?
No. The governor's mansion got torched. They've never arrested anybody, and they've never figured out who did it. It was being guarded by the Department of Public Safety, and if you ask anybody at the Department of Public Safety about it, they still flinch. It was a real blot on their record. It turned out that a bunch of the cameras that they had around the Capitol weren't working, and this is kind of the one that got away.
As a Texas senator, Dan Patrick voted against the last two budgets for education and health care. In both cases, because the cuts were not big enough. Well, because like Hidalgo County used to be 28 years average, now we're 26, we're getting younger. North of I-10, the Red River is becoming older, high 30s, maybe low 40s. Those education and healthcare dollars predominantly coming to the border region. Could we expect Dan Patrick to continue to be the same kind of CEO of the Texas Senate as he has been a senator within that particular body, especially in view of the fact that you just pointed out, he did not come to the middle even though he came to the general election?
How bad is it going to be?
Well, the lieutenant governor doesn't get to vote on the budget, so there's that. Dan Patrick has sort of two aspects here. One of them is on the budgets that he voted against, he helped negotiate the numbers. So one of the things Joe Strauss says, if you say, do you think you can work with Dan Patrick? He says, yeah, we work together really well on education bill, and to some extent on education funding. And I think he was as surprised as anybody when Patrick then came out and voted against that. So as lieutenant governor, and this is an open question, as lieutenant governor, do you get the Dan Patrick who was able to negotiate and work these things? Or do you get the Dan Patrick who's sort of the rhetorical firebrand who voted against these things? And I think part of that's going to be Dan Patrick himself, and I think part of that is going to be, and really the part that I have more of an eye on, is the body of the Senate is much more conservative than it was. There's always a question at the beginning of any session of whether which chamber is going to be the accelerator and which chamber is going to be the brake. And then in all other things being equal in a normal world, the House is the hot, fast, emotional, things can go haywire body, and the Senate is where things slow down. It's the Thomas Jefferson idea about the teacup and the saucer, right? But this time I think the Senate is the accelerator and the House is the brakes. So I'm actually curious to see what the answer to your question is.
Hi, Ross.
Oh, this is a loaded one. She knows what she's talking about.
No. I have a lot of questions. Some of them I'll ask afterwards. A couple of things on higher ed. Do you think that tuition, that we'll see tuition possibly regulated again? And then do you think that they will take away the in-state tuition for immigrant students?
This actually goes to his question. I'll answer your second question first. In-state tuition for the children, I think the thing is you have to have lived in Texas for 3 years, you have to have graduated from a Texas high school, and you have to have applied for citizenship. And under current law, signed by Rick Perry and backed by Rick Perry at his peril in the last presidential campaign, those kids get in-state tuition. There's a big call to repeal that law, and I think Dan Patrick is for repeal. Greg Abbott, I think, has said he would sign it, but I'm not positive of that. I expect that to be a big fight in this legislature. If you go back to Perry's presidential campaign, the last one, there will be another one. If you go back to the last one, everybody remembers oops. But oops happened 6 or 7 weeks after he was in single digits in that race. His high point was when he got in. Everybody loves the new boy at the dance, right? So he came in and he's at like 35% approval. And then they went into a debate where he said, if you don't support the DREAM Act, you don't have a heart. And his numbers went, pew. Mitt Romney looked like he'd just eaten a canary. And that's a really unpopular position outside of Texas. So, and it's gotten to be a really, if you run a national election in your state that's about the president and about national politics and about immigration and things like that, you're going to nationalize a lot of positions. So rather than Texas exporting idea that is understood on the border maybe differently than it is in Iowa or New Hampshire, we're now importing Iowa and New Hampshire down to Texas. And I think we'll see.
Yeah, I just think that with Abbott trying to appeal to Latinos, it might be a bad message. He may have to stay away from
It puts Abbott in a very uncomfortable position. The first question is about tuition. The state legislature used to control tuition and deregulated it in 2003, I think. Tom Craddock bill. Deregulated it in 2003 and told the schools, you can raise tuition, be reasonable and watch your politics, but we're leaving price setting to you and we're cutting your subsidies from the state. So if they want to re-regulate tuition, they have to say, A, you can't raise your price, and B, the colleges are going to come back and say, we can't afford this. And so the state's going to have to put some money in. So now we're back into the budget. They've been loath to spend money. There's a real tension in Austin right now. I guess this is like one of the central issues in any government. It's like, what do you really want and what are you willing to pay for? And it's that balance. And this is one of those issues where the clamor for some control over tuition is growing. Letitia Van de Putte had a position in the lieutenant governor's race that didn't quite catch but didn't really get ruled out. That was, let's take some money out of the rainy day fund and put it in a revolving fund that would let everybody in the state do 2 years of community college for free. And then they could decide whether they just wanted an associate's degree, whether they actually just wanted it for a trade, or whether they want to take that and go on to a 4-year college. We actually have the money to do that. It's sort of interesting. But it didn't get a fully blown discussion. I wouldn't be surprised if some of your former colleagues don't file that bill.
That's my question. I don't think there's any dispute among any part of any party about the importance of community colleges with the adequate funding that we now have. What are the prospects of the legislature finally funding community colleges adequately?
I don't think they're any better or worse than they have been. I think that's a fight. This is one of those, how much money do you want and where would it come from fights. I don't think that they disagree about the efficacy of this. I don't think that anybody really thinks it's a bad idea. But it is one of those things where you go in and you say, okay, so you think it would be good to spend this much money on this. Where do you think we should get it? And that's just a matter of, do we use new money? Do we steal it from something else? How does that go? And that's, in fact, where that's always hung up. Community colleges for the last 2 sessions have been like the last week's argument of the budget fight. You'll walk down the hall in the Capitol, watching the conference committees that are reconciling the House and Senate versions of a bill, and you'll see all the community college lobbyists sitting on a bench outside of a room. So what are you guys up to? Now And I expect we'll probably see that again.
But there was a problem of where whether there was money. There's not that problem this time. There is money.
Well, there is new money. So now you're fighting against this cap. So if I say we spent $100 last time and this time we're going to spend $108, part of the $8 is eaten up by inflation and population growth, right? We have more kids in schools. Inflation made it more expensive to put every one of them there. We have more, we grew the rolls at Medicaid by this much, and the cost of fulfilling each case has gone up. That's where most of that $8 goes, and then you fight over what's left. Or you go back down into the $100 that was there last time, and you say, well, we don't need that program anymore, and we kill it. It's not a fight for new money. It's not like there's a dollar on the table. It's a fight against everybody else who wants new money. You know the joke about the two campers and the grizzly bear? They're sitting at the campfire and they see a grizzly bear bearing down on them, and one starts putting his shoes on and the other one looks at him and says, what are you doing? You can't outrun a grizzly bear. And he says, I don't have to outrun the grizzly bear. I just have to outrun you. That's a little bit what the end of the budget's like. Yes, sir.
I've got the mic, so let me just go ahead because my voice is a little raspy. One of the key questions that I asked you before is your perspective on what Austin and the Chandler classes have towards South Texas and below I-10, because as you well know, it keeps on gathering steam and influence and power. What's your reaction to that observation?
Well, I think they view, it's an economic engine. Most of the political attention south of I-10 and along the border has been about immigration. And, there's this continuing thing. I mean, this is, I'll be an El Paso guy for a minute. There's this continuing problem. If they voted their weight, if El Paso could make a fist, it's the size of Collin County. Everybody running for statewide office in Texas goes to Collin County 19 times while they're running. They go to El Paso twice and they say, it's way out there. If it voted, it wouldn't be way out there anymore. And to some extent, that's the issue in the valley too. If you want attention, you have to vote. You have to do things that they have. Politicians, whatever else you think of politicians, they are responsive. And when a Republican office holder looks at Texas in purely electoral political terms, they see 7 counties, and none of them are south of I-10. So you have to become one of the counties. Or you have to become one of the 7 counties that the Democrats look at, if the Democrats are a threat. When the Democrats were threatening, Cameron and Hidalgo were on every Republican's visit list. Abbott's reaching out. I think he sees I think he's playing a couple of things. I think he saw that he didn't have to fight for his 7 counties. He had huge campaign war chests, so they didn't have any financing problems. And he saw a long-term gain in, I'm going to make a play for these voters that haven't been voting Republican before, some of them haven't been voting before, and I'm going to put them in contention. And if the Republicans are in South Texas contending for votes that the Democrats assume or have assumed that they always had, then you sort of rise on the radar some. And I think that's what's going on here. I think there's a reason Greg Abbott visited down here. I think there's a reason that you all know what his mother-in-law looks like. Saw those billboards, saw those TV commercials, and I think they're probably going to continue to have a presence. The tail of the tape in this, at least early, is going to be in appointments. So there's the Secretary of State. There's 3 openings on the A&M board. There's 3 openings on the UT board. There's, these things start to open up in February. Just watch the appointments and you'll see you can see pretty quickly how you rate.
I have one question, I guess then we'll be done.
We got one up here before you do that.
Oh.
Did you have a?
Russ, thank you so much for coming all the way down here and visiting with us today. It's very insightful.
It's not that far. They have planes and stuff.
Well, as you were saying, some of the candidates who have been running for office haven't visited us as much as maybe they have other areas. So maybe they need to find those planes. But my question is that Dan Patrick, when he was first elected, and as soon as he was sworn in, tried to break the 2/3 rule in the Senate. And it goes back to what you were saying about the accelerators and the brake. And I'm wondering what's going to happen first day of session and that 2/3 rule?
The 2/3 rule is a rule basically that says that it takes 2/3 of the senators to, if 2/3 of the, you have to have 2/3 of the senators agree to take up an issue before you can start a debate on it. And it empowers a minority. If I have 12 senators, I can block a bill, right? If you're on a partisan bill, most of the time this isn't used, I mean, this is really widely misunderstood. Most of the time when the 2/3 rule is used, it's not on partisan stuff. It's usually these 12 senators really don't want to change that regulation for this company, or change the scope of practice for this medical thing, or mess with this tuition bill, or whatever it is. But in any case, they have this 2/3 rule, and they've, periodically on politics, they just break it. They just basically find a way to wire around it. That's one of the things that happened on the night of that Wendy Davis filibuster that kind of made her famous. Dan Patrick said during the Republican primary, I'm going to get rid of the 2/3 rule. And because they were competing with Dan Patrick and he was outrunning them, David Dewhurst, Jerry Patterson, and Todd Staples all said the same thing. Now you're starting to hear some noise from some of the more experienced Democratic senators. John Whitmire has done this a little bit from Houston, sort of reminding everybody in the Senate about, you remember that one time you used the 2/3 rule to stop this, and that one time, the reason we have a Republican congressional redistricting map is because David Sibley, who was then a Republican in the minority in the Senate, used the 2/3 rule to block the Democratic map. This plays both ways. So the Democratic senators are sort of saying, be careful what you wish for. I think what you're going to get is a 60% rule. So they're going to change what 2/3 is 66%. It's basically 21 votes in the Senate. They're going to change it to a 60% rule. It'll be 19. Guess how many Republicans there are? So
That then gives the Lieutenant Governor the authority or the ability to recognize somebody, to bring a bill up, and that's the log jam that keeps stuff from being heard. There is a bill introduced by Mando Martinez and Lucio, Representative Lucio, for a UT-RGV Law School. Is that, who has to be convinced about that? The UT system or the legislature to fund it, or how likely is it?
there's three fights here, whenever you do something like this. The first fight is the money there in the budget? The second fight is, where are UT and A&M on this? Sort of the ongoing, regular, friendly battle of the chancellors, right? And then the other one is inside the system itself. Does UT want another law school? And if they want another law school, where do they want another law school, right? A&M spent years trying to get a law school up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and couldn't do it, and finally bought one. They bought Texas Wesleyan, and now there's a Texas A&M law school. You guys know all the long fights for medical schools, all the long fights for campuses. I think that's a long fight.